It's interesting, the things that Matthew was saying at the very beginning about the reasons for the scheme and the student expectations and the challenges around providing core texts, they're exactly the same reasons that have driven our project at UEL. But there are some big differences. The project at UEL is a university project and it involved the library, but shall we say not really from the beginning. But it is an evolving project that we've learned an awful lot from. So the perspective I'm coming at is slightly different as a librarian, but also as a member of the university's management team. I was involved in some discussions about the principles around the scheme. So my talk's going to take a slightly different sort of tack, I think, probably. Just to set the scene, UEL is a very interesting and I would say quite a unique university. We have a history of widening participation. And I would say the majority of our students are first-generation university students. We have a very diverse population. I won't go into all the figures that are up there, but it is a very diverse community. And not all of our students will have encountered necessarily mobile learning or certainly mobile technologies, except perhaps as a phone or, in their everyday life. So that's a bit of a challenge as well in terms of encouraging them to use e-resources even within the library. Although I think we've done a pretty good job and we now have a majority of our budget is spent on digital resources as opposed to print. We're in a very large department which also offers learning support. So we have a particular interest in ensuring that everything we do enables and enhances learning in whatever way that we can. So just to tell you a bit of a history around how we got to e-books and the e-book scheme that the university now operates. It started off with a free book scheme, as was mentioned earlier, which was very much focused on print. And the driver behind that really was to actually maximise the use of the large proportion of offer funding that the university receives. We're actually one of the biggest recipients of offer funding in the UK. We already had a bursary scheme which we worked in partnership with John Smiths, who are also book suppliers, to provide. So we already had an existing partnership and via them, ultimately, a partnership with Core Text who work collaboratively with John Smiths. So that's really where it came from. But the print book scheme, although an excellent scheme which delivered to every single student a core textbook for each of their modules, you can imagine the logistics of doing that across 2 campuses. And, just storing and distributing that number of items was a challenge. I won't go into all the details, but equally we had the challenge of getting the titles from our academic colleagues and having them make a decision about which text was the most important. And I think colleagues referred to that earlier. That's quite challenging. And when I say we, I'm not talking about the library necessarily, I'm talking about the university. The scheme was actually run by a strange combination, you might think, of IT services, finance and our Vice-Chancellor's group, because it was the sort of big idea that came via the bursary route. So that's really why it originated there. Just to say a little bit about the backdrop to this, whilst the free print book scheme was going on, the library had been looking at delivering the delivery of e-textbooks and how students were using their own mobile devices and potentially e-readers, tablets, a variety of devices to access information resources. And one of my colleagues ran a pilot with our law school with both a postgraduate and an undergraduate module to assess the students' responses to using electronic books on mobile devices. And it was highly successful, not least because it converted some of our law colleagues into using ebooks much more as part of their teaching and embedding that much more within their curriculum. So it was a toe in the water to some extent, but it encouraged us to introduce a loanable tablet scheme within our libraries. And that was a self-service scheme, which I think we provided 40 tablets in each of our libraries through self-service lockers where they charge up. And there was a huge uptake by students. They really loved it. And they weren't necessarily students who didn't have tablets, but they were students who perhaps hadn't brought it with them that day, who maybe wanted to use another device, students who might have been working in groups. So we already had a bit of success in the library, and we were developing, we felt, a culture around the use of mobile technology to access resources. Now, The Free Books Replacement Scheme, which is a very unfortunate title, because as you'll see later, it led us down all sorts of difficult communication routes, which weren't particularly helpful in the way students are now looking on the project. But this is further down the line. This is, 2 years ago, we started to look at, okay, let's review this print books project. And there was a will, as well as some evidence via the library and other sources, that students could benefit from having a mobile device, as well as free textbooks. And the obvious decision, the obvious decision from the university's management point of view was, well, let's trial this with level 1 first-year students. Let's give everybody a tablet, and it will be preloaded with the core textbooks, which they would have received in print. Just to cut a long story very short, we had options around our suppliers. Just the same as Middlesex, we opted to go with Core Text, who, as I say, already worked in partnership with John Smith's, who were already in partnership with the university. So that was a logical route. And Core Text negotiated with publishers on behalf of the university, and they absorbed the costs of that on behalf of the university. So we had an excellent partnership going, and it was quite a short lead-in. We wanted to distribute the tablets in September 2014. And there was a lot of discussion about whether this was feasible, but in the end, it was achieved. And the devices that I've described there were distributed to all our students on enrolment. The details are there. They were skinned, it's not a word I like, but this is the word I'm told that we use, to provide UEL apps, as well as the Core Text app, which gave students access to the e-books. Now, the library, being librarians and very opportunistic, we immediately lighted on this and said, we have to have our app on this tablet. So we sort of muscled our way into the project group and said, we've developed an app, it has to be on there. We want the library resources to be equally accessible so that students are aware that there's also a whole wealth of other resource outside of their core texts. And we were successful in that. We were in fact the only department within the university to develop an app, so we managed to get in early. And that proved to be very useful. We also, from a very early stage, saw it as an opportunity to promote the digital library. It coincided with one of our schools moving into a brand new building, which was located just beyond the campus boundary. It wasn't a long walk to the library, but they found that a challenge. And so having the tablets distributed gave us an opportunity to do a promotion around, this is your library, your mobile library. So we kind of used this to our best advantage. Module leaders were also given the devices. I would say perhaps we should have at that stage done a little bit more work with academic colleagues, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But every module leader received a tablet, training was provided, and they were given some of the background to the project around what students would be receiving and what the expectations were. But at that stage of the project was very much about delivering the content to the students in an electronic format, and alongside that they had a tablet which they could use. The challenge around that was students' perceptions around that, whether they actually saw the benefit of the multiple uses of a tablet. What they actually saw was, I'm getting my books in a different way. And that, again, was a communications issue, I think. This just illustrates what the tablet looked like. And on the left-hand side, that's the website that was put up, which was the help site for students wanting to access their ebooks and also to set up and use the tablet. There were some challenges around this. Core Text and John Smith's were actually very good about providing support on campus, at enrolment, and at various points where students were likely to require that support. As I'll explain a bit later on, the library got heavily involved in that support, and again, we saw quite quickly that there would be an expectation around library support, not least because we also provide first-line IT support in our buildings, and so it was a natural place for students to go. As I've mentioned, Matthew described this and Paul earlier, that the means of accessing the books was through the bookshelf in a very similar way to Middlesex. But there were challenges for students on using the mobile device, and they needed to actually register twice. It was like a double registration in order to access the books through the app. So that did cause some challenges for students. This is what the books look like. I'm going to skip over that because I want to talk about the library support. This is where the library team really came into its own in terms of the project. And as I say early on, we recognised that there'd be an expectation that we would provide support. So we nominated champions in the library teams, particularly people on the front line, to become familiar with the tablets, to become familiar with core text, and to provide that support to students. Subject librarians picked up on it really quickly as really early adopters who saw it as a huge benefit. There was no distinction whether this was a library project or not. It was a huge opportunity. And the subject librarians took tablets into their induction sessions. They demonstrated them to students. They talked to them about the content, but also about the device. And I think that was the first step towards trying to help students contextualise it within learning and teaching, rather than, oh, here's my book, and I don't know how to use it because it's an electronic format. We also introduced a pop-up librarian scheme, and that's a picture of Nick, our very own pop-up librarian, who has done a fantastic job over the previous 2 semesters, popping up in all sorts of places like cafes, corridors, with his banner. Now, this was sort of a byproduct of the project, if you like, where again we saw an opportunity and we said, right, let's use this to our advantage. Let's get out there, let's promote the library resources, but we can also support students in using the tablets. Now, the challenges, I've mentioned a couple of these. There was a lack of single sign-on, which I know Core Text are looking at, and we're working on that for next year. We're also looking in the longer term of developing the app so that the one app, the Core Text app, can be used to access library ebooks as well. There's a long way to go on that. But that's one of the things that we've been discussing with Core Text to try and simplify that access route for students. Communication issues, I'll talk a bit more about those because my red light's going. The communication issues, I think, were the most challenging because I think we missed a trick. We didn't contextualise it fully enough within teaching and learning. We called the tablets project replacement books project, and it really wasn't that at all. It was about transforming the experience for students, and I don't think we really caught on to that ourselves quickly enough. So in the future, we're going to pay a lot more attention to the learning and teaching aspects. The phase 2 of the project's being led by our Centre for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, along with IT colleagues. The library is very much a part of that. My colleague Tom Shaw is here today. He's our head of digital library. He's involved in the project from the start this time. We're going to take on board all the student feedback we've had and really try to work with students in that development, but most importantly with academic colleagues, because I think that was where they needed to be involved much earlier in the process. So the ambition now is to develop a range of apps around learning and teaching, which will sit alongside the Core Text app, the library app. So there'll be a suite of services available to students from day one, preloaded onto their tablet. And then we have the challenge that was talked about much earlier today around digital literacies. And, you know, I don't think we can take for granted that our students understand how to use tablets, e-resources, in learning and teaching context. They might be very familiar with it in their daily lives, but they do want us to help them to make better use within the learning and teaching context. So that's the challenge for us for the next phase. Obviously, I'll answer any questions later on. I think I've come to the end of my time now, so thank you.